Hello, welcome everyone to today's Authors Guild Foundation webinar on handling student loans without having a full-blown panic attack. We've got Erin Lowry here again today. This talk is part of our series Money Matters, The Road to Financial Literacy, where we're covering a variety of finance topics as they pertain to authors. You can find other videos on our website or our YouTube where we've discussed freelancer finances, advances, royalty statements, and other such topics. And there's more coming throughout the summer, so stay tuned. Of course, today we're talking about student loans, which can play a huge role in everyone's actual day-to-day, month-to-month finances. So it's important whether you already have student loans or are considering taking more. So thank you, Erin Lowry, for joining us. Erin's the host of the Money Matters series. We're very happy to have her here. She's the author of the three-book series, The Broke Millennial. She's been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, on CNBC, and many other great media outlets. So thank you, Erin. Everyone, thank you for submitting questions in advance. We're going to talk about all the things that you want to hear about, and feel free to use the Q&A box below if you have any more questions, and we'll get to those at the end. And we have subtitles available if you'd like as well. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Erin.
Well, thank you so much. And hi, everyone. Wonderful to be here with you. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so we can kick it off with the deck. And as mentioned, I'm Erin Lowry. I work professionally as, I like to call myself, a financial translator, helping people figure out how best to handle their money. And student loans are obviously a huge topic, not just for the millennial generation, even though that is my specialty. And I was actually in a situation where I was fortunate enough to initially avoid student loans. And that happened through a combination of electing a college that gave me the most amount in scholarship money. And I was fortunate enough to have a family situation where my parents could afford the other 50% of my college education. But I like to say I did give up going to my dream school in order to live my dream life. Now, fast forward to getting married, and I actually did end up inheriting student loan debt, if you will. My husband had a little over $50,000 worth of student loans, a mixture of both private and public. And we were able to pay those down fairly quickly in a little less than 2 years with a really aggressive repayment plan. So that is something I can get into later. I know there were some questions about what you do to pay off student loans in a relationship. So always happy to talk about that topic. But suffice to say, not only from my work writing as Broke Millennial, but also having a relationship and a partner who ended up with significant student loans, I am intimately aware with federal, private, and everything in between. So let's talk about how to handle them. The first thing that I do want to get into before we actually get into the nitty-gritty of student loans themselves is talking about student loan relief. So many of you have probably noticed that over a year, since March of 2020, student loans actually have been put on pause. Now, this pertains to federal student loans. The federal government does not have control over private lenders and private student loans, but those have come in the form of three big things. One, suspended payments. So you have not had to make payments on your federal student loans since March 27th of 2020. Now, I do want to say for anybody who is on an income-driven repayment plan or is working towards a forgiveness program, this time actually does still count towards that total. It's as if you have still been making payments for the last about 15 months. So something to keep in mind. We'll dig into what those plans are and what all that means later. There's also been a freeze put on defaulted student loans that were in collections, and interest rates were brought down to 0%. And what's really important to know is this interest has been waived, not deferred. And the difference is when you waive interest, and this also matters on things like credit cards, auto loans, anything else that you purchase. If interest is waived, you never have to pay it. It just always is at zero, never was accruing. If interest is deferred, what that means is for a period of time, you didn't have to pay it, but at some point, all that interest is going to come back and get added to your student loan. So in this case, as part of pandemic relief and student loan suspensions, all the interest that would have normally been accruing since April of 2020 is now just being forgiven and canceled. Now, this actually has been extended multiple times, but currently the student loan suspension is set to expire on September 30th of this year, of 2021. So as it stands right now, we all need to anticipate starting to make payments on student loans on October 1st of 2021. Now, keep your eyes on the news. There is a chance, of course, that the Biden administration could extend the forgiveness, but it's not a guarantee, so it's good to plan. Now, I've been asked a lot over the last, I would say, 6 months is, do I think that the Biden administration is going to cancel student loan debt? There has been a lot of conversation around the topic of student loan debt cancellation. Biden himself on the campaign trail talked about this idea of canceling $10,000 per individual. Of course, there's been big pushes for it to be a lot more than that. Up to about $50,000 has been a big proposal. But to be honest, I think it's very doubtful that he will ever cancel all student loan debt. There's over $1.7 trillion in student loan debt that exists today. Now, a small fraction of that is private student loan, but the government owns, I think it's about 1.5 of that $1.7 trillion in student loans. Now, it is good to know that the Biden administration has canceled close to $3 billion for a few groups of people. So those who attended a for-profit university or a university or college that engaged in deceptive or illegal practices or closed suddenly, if you have student loans based on that criteria, that debt was canceled. Or borrowers who have total or permanent disability, their student loan debt has also been canceled. But $3 billion sounds like a lot. It's just a tiny fraction. I believe it's 0.01% of $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. So even though it's a high overarching number, really is like not even a drop in the bucket of the amount of debt that is owed to the federal government. Now, I'm saying all this because I do think while it's great to wish for the best in terms of student loan debt at some point being canceled, whether in full or partially, I think it's really important for us to prepare for the likelihood, not the worst necessarily, but the likelihood that we will have to keep making payments on these student loans. When we're thinking about taking back control, the first thing that's really important for you to know about are income-driven repayment plans. Referred to as IDR, there's multiple forms of income-driven repayment plans, but the point of them is that they are able to give you some level of breathing room on your monthly payments because your monthly payment is capped based on your actual income, not based on the amount that you technically owe to all of your lenders, based on the amount that you borrowed. Now, I know that that kind of sounds like a lot, so we are going to break it down. So payments are a percentage of your discretionary income. And there is a fun catch to this. It's based on your tax return. So if you get married and then you file a return as married filing jointly, your spouse's income will impact the amount of money that the government sees you making, and that is going to impact the amount that you owe every month on your income-driven repayment plan. So in a hypothetical situation, if you are, let's say, a public school teacher and you're making $45,000, and you've been making your payments on that amount of money, and maybe they're capped at something that feels really reasonable, a little over $200 a month. You get married, maybe your partner makes more, maybe they make something like $60,000. Now you as a household are making $100,000. That's the amount of money they're going to be determining your monthly payments on, that $100,000, not the $40,000. So that is something to consider. Currently, there's a bit of a loophole. You could do married filing separately. Right now, you still technically can do that and have your income-driven repayment plans based on separate incomes. They have talked about closing that loophole soon, but something for you to keep in mind. Now, income-driven repayment plans are only available for federal student loans. If you have a private student loan, it is not eligible for an income-driven repayment plan. I mentioned this term, discretionary income, and everybody's always like, what the heck is discretionary income? What that means for the purposes of an income-driven repayment plan, and stick with me here, I'm going to throw a formula at you, is this idea of the difference between your annual income and 150% of the poverty guideline for the family size of your state of residence. That is jargon to mean that in the 48 states, or excluding Alaska and Hawaii, they have slightly different numbers. The poverty line for a family of one is $12,880. So if you times that by 150%, you're at $19,320. So this is a baseline for just you as an individual. So what the government's going to do, Department of Education is going to do, is $45,000. Let's say that's your annual income minus the poverty guideline times 150%, so $19,320 equals a little shy of $26,000. That $26,000, that is your discretionary income. That is the amount of money that they are using to run a formula to determine how much you could reasonably afford to pay monthly on your student loans. So even if you owe $75,000 to the federal government in student loan debt, they're going to use that discretionary income to figure out how much you can actually afford to put towards that debt every month. So the income-driven repayment plans look at different percentages. We're going to focus on one called Repay, Revised Pay As You Earn, and it caps at 10% of your discretionary income. So that means that they won't charge you more than 10% of that nearly $26,000. So that's $2,568 per year is how much they're going to ask you to be putting towards your student loans. Don't panic, that's not monthly, that's over the year. So your monthly payment's going to be about $214, depending on how much you have in student loans. Now, I know that's a lot to throw all at once. We're going to pause at the end of this section if you have any questions specific to income-driven repayment plans. But I wanted to explain a little bit about what discretionary income meant, because I feel like every time people talk about this, that word gets thrown around and it's not really contextualized. So that's what all of that means. Now, for thinking back to the idea of enrolling yourself on an income-driven repayment plan, the one that I usually recommend people consider at this point is something called Revised Pay As You Earn, or REPAY. They're all about clever acronyms. So if you're thinking about undergraduate loans that you're trying to pay off, what you would have to do is make 20 years worth of payments, or if it's graduate school loans, 25 years worth of payments, and then any remainder that exists will automatically be forgiven. So this is a way for you to have a monthly payment on your student loans that theoretically should fit in with the budget that you have, the amount of income that you're making. And then at the end of a fairly lengthy repayment time, 20 to 25 years, any remainder will be forgiven. This, especially for creatives, can be incredibly valuable as a tool for repayment and being able to actually focus on other financial goals in the medium and even long term. And particularly for people who went to perhaps more expensive liberal universities or liberal arts colleges, ended up with, let's say, $60,000 to $100,000 in student loan debt over the course of maybe undergraduate and graduate school. And if you want to pursue your dreams or you want to pursue a career that's not traditionally high paying, it's really helpful to have a system where you can be making a payment that's prorated to your income, and ultimately a chunk of that money can be forgiven. Could the government offer us something better? Of course they could. Do they currently? No. So we're just having to play ball with the rules of the game that they have subjected us to. One thing that you need to know, though, about your income-driven repayment plans is they are made eligible by going through something called a direct consolidation loan. So that's a way to bundle all of your loans together, consolidate them into one loan, and then you enroll that particular loan onto the income-driven repayment plan. There are loans that are not eligible, the ones that I've listed here below, usually PLUS loans that are made out to parents, or the FFEL PLUS loans. But for most of us, the majority of our federal student loans are eligible to be enrolled. Now, once we get through this thought about income-driven repayment plans, I do want to talk about forgiveness programs. There's a few different options that you can consider. Again, these are only available to federal student loans. These are not open for private student loans, but there's teacher loan forgiveness, public service loan forgiveness, income-driven repayment, which we just mentioned at the end of 20 to 25 years, the remainder gets forgiven. And then if you have either in the past or currently serve in the military. Now I'm going to focus on the top two, that teacher loan forgiveness and public service loan forgiveness. Before I move on, though, I just wanted to check, do we have any questions specifically about income-driven repayment plans that you want clarified right now? Just check real quick. All right.
We were asked for advice on, you covered this a little bit, if you're married and the income is lopsided, is that just a matter of doing the math on how it breaks down jointly or separately?
So when you're thinking about paying back as a couple, the first thing I would consider is, do you both have student loans? Because in the situation that, yes, you're both trying to pay off student loans and you're paying them off on income-driven repayment plans, it could really work out to your benefit to separate and do a tax return that's married filing separately. However, this is where I do say talk to an accountant. They are worth the money if you have a more complicated tax form. And the reason I say talk to one is because if you file separately, there are other tax code perks that you're going to be given up. So you need to make sure that filing together actually makes the most, or filing separately makes the most sense compared to the amount that you could recoup filing together. The other slightly complicated wrench I will throw into this is you should run the math on whether you should actually legally get married right now. And I say that because if you are both in really intense amounts of student loan debt. So this often really is more for people who went to like law school or med school, but might have well into 6 figures of student loans. It could actually hurt your repayment plans to then be tied to somebody else's income. And there could actually be kind of a marriage tax penalty. I detailed this a lot in my book, Broke Millennial Talks Money. I interviewed a couple that have been together for I think 12 years now. They call each other husband and wife, but they're not legally married because of their current student loan liability. And they did the math that it would have cost them, I think, $300,000 or so to get married and not be able to take advantage of certain repayment programs. Just something to think about. I obviously did get married. My husband has student loans. We knew that it was going to impact his. And that's one reason that we really didn't focus long-term on the income-driven repayment plans. And we just focused on creating our own aggressive debt payoff plan, because we knew that the amount that his income-driven repayment was going to go up each month after we got married and our incomes combined, because it was beneficial for us to file jointly, just wasn't mathematically going to check out. It's a long-winded way to say, hire an accountant and have them run the numbers and sit down and talk through all the different options with you. But if you both have student loan debt, it could be beneficial to file separately so that your income-driven repayment plans are based solely on your separate incomes as opposed to combining them. Now, if you're in a situation where maybe you are the lower income earner, your husband or your wife doesn't have student loan debt and makes a significant amount of money, you might just want to consider entirely working together to pay off the student loan debt. We can get into it at the end, this whole idea of people wanting to take complete ownership over their student loans. They don't want help from their spouse. Just consider the fact that long-term, it's still impacting the financial household. So even if you're not asking your spouse to help you with the money financially, it is still impacting the bottom line of the household. So it does make a lot of sense in most cases to work as a team. You could get a prenup to defend against, like, hey, if you help your partner pay off their debt and then they leave you 2 years later, you can have a prenup with all sorts of provisions to protect people. But that gets into a whole separate conversation.
Such a romantic webinar.
I know. I am big on team prenup. I will say that right now we did have provisions for, I'm going to help you aggressively pay off student loans. If I pay off your student loans and you divorce me a year later, you have to pay some of it back. So it is just good to know that that is an option.
That's a great conversation to have. All right, well, I'm sure everyone is also interested in learning about forgiveness. Not paying the student loans is enticing.
It is. So let's talk about teacher loan forgiveness first. So the offer is up to $17,500 of forgiveness on eligible federal student loans, which, to be honest, is the majority of student loans. The ones that were also ineligible for those income-driven repayment plans also are not necessarily eligible for forgiveness, often Parent Plus loans. There are some eligibility catches that you always need to look out for. So for those of you who are joining this webinar who went to college maybe several decades ago, it is important to know that usually your loans must have been from October 1st of 1998 for this program or and beyond. So from 1998 to today, that's when you had to have taken out your loans in order to be eligible. If you went or graduated college before that time period, unfortunately, your loans are not considered eligible. I cannot tell you why they arbitrarily did this. You must be a highly qualified teacher for 5 complete and consecutive academic years. That part is really important to acknowledge, that it's not only 5 years, but it's also supposed to be consecutive academic years. Highly qualified varies a little bit, but typically means that you have a bachelor's, you have the necessary certifications for your state. And you must be employed by a school that serves low-income students. This is also critical. You cannot be a private school teacher or even a public school teachers in certain districts in order to qualify for forgiveness. The other thing that I find kind of odd about forgiveness is that up to $17,500 is because some teachers are deemed more, I'm just going to use the word valuable than others in terms of what they're teaching. So typically STEM-centric teachers are going to actually get more money than teachers who are in the arts fields. So that is another thing for you to look into when it comes to forgiveness programs, is how much your specific field is actually eligible for when it comes to teaching. And I say that too because it actually might not make a whole lot of sense for you to stay for 5 complete and consecutive years at a particular school if you're only going to get $6,000 worth of student loans forgiven compared to hopping to a different school that's going to potentially pay you more. Just again, numbers that you have to run. Now, public service loan forgiveness is sort of the big kahuna when it comes to the forgiveness programs. It also has gotten the most press because in 2017 was the first wave of eligibility, and this whole program started in 2007. It's a 10-year program. So 2017 is when the first wave of applicants came up, and the acceptance rate was atrocious. We're talking like 1% acceptance rate of the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who submitted paperwork. So this put the whole thing into chaos, cast a whole amount of doubt and this long shadow over the program. I know we got some questions ahead of time about like, what's the likelihood I'm actually going to get this forgiven? Now, first I want to say, one perk of the Biden administration, they have tried to make this less complicated, loosen the reins a little bit. For anyone, you'll see at the bottom, if you've been rejected, please check out the temporary expanded public service loan forgiveness. And you can also like check out that link at the bottom. I know it's just like there, you have to type things in, but studentaid.gov is a wonderful resource. Highly recommend you check it out. But back to the point of public service loan forgiveness, PSLF. Eligibility is working a qualifying public service job for 10 years. Does not have to be consecutive, but it makes it easier if it is. And you have to make 120 qualifying payments. This starts on October 1st of 2007. So you have to have had your loan has to have been distributed to you from October 1st, 2007 or after to qualify. The other thing to keep in mind, that 120 qualifying payments, you cannot try to do multiple payments in a month for eligibility. It has to actually be 120 months. They want you to go for the full 10 years. Now, some things to keep in mind for trying to make your life easier when you actually try to apply for the forgiveness. One, ensure that your loans are on an eligible income-driven repayment plan. A big issue that happened for people who applied in 2017 in that first wave is that never got made clear to them. So there were people who were looking to have all of their federal loans forgiven and had never consolidated them and put them on an income-driven repayment plan. So that repay one that I mentioned earlier would qualify. There are others, but it is really important that you put it on a qualifying payment plan. The other thing is to actually go through and submit your employment certification annually. You're not required to do this. However, trying to go back over 10 years worth of employment and collect the appropriate signatures in order to submit your paperwork and waiting until the last month of the deadline to do that, there could be managers that you had at your first job who like are not even walking on this earth anymore. So it is really critical that you actually get those certifications done each year and submit the paperwork and keep meticulous record for yourself so that when you get to the final push of submitting all of the information, you're not trying to find people that you worked for 6-7 years ago and they can't push back on you to say that it's invalid. So that is my really big advice if you are interested in public service loan forgiveness. I also want to address the reality of working for a nonprofit through this pandemic. There have been a lot of people who were let go from jobs in the nonprofit sectors, as well as obviously other qualifying public service jobs, including ones for the government, whether that's on a state level or a national level. The work that you have done still counts. So again, I would get all of that certified. But if you end up in the private sector and never return to public service, then that's just the end of the road in terms of trying to get PSLF. If you take some time off and come back, you still can count. It doesn't have to be consecutive, but it is important to know, let's say that you were working for the federal government and then you were furloughed and ultimately laid off during the pandemic, and you worked for 7 years and now you are currently not working a nonprofit or other qualifying job. You have to, in order to be able to get eligibility for PSLF. I do just want to make sure that everybody understands that part of it.
So the eligibility is government or nonprofit, 501c3.
Yep. So it has to be public service. There is all sorts of different levels of government, including tribal. So if you work for a sovereign nation, for a Native American tribe, for instance, that also can count. And if you are a certain type of lawyer, certain type of doctor, certain type of teachers, all of that can count. So I would just make sure to do your research to see if whatever job you work, even if you're not traditionally at a nonprofit or traditionally working for the federal government, you still actually might ultimately qualify. So it is worth looking into.
Do you have any other examples?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Do you have any other examples of why people have been rejected?
So a big part of it was either you weren't on the proper income-driven repayment plan, or they couldn't certify that you actually worked for those organizations that you claim to have worked for. And also that in 2017, they just, I don't think, had the infrastructure to properly do it. Whether things were happening in like a nefarious way on the inside, we will never know. There certainly are some conspiracy theories around that. But for the most part, it felt like they had just never really explained to people properly all the stuff that you needed. And when people filed the paperwork, they were either missing 1 year certification or one little signature or one piece of paperwork, and then just got rejected. You can resubmit, and there is the temporary suspension one that I referenced earlier. So I'll just go back there. So temporary expanded public service loan forgiveness. So I would recommend going through that process as well. If you in 2017 or since have tried submitting and got rejected, and if you did, I would love to hear if they gave you a reason why, what the why was. Anything else on forgiveness before we move on?
I think we can move on. I typed that link into the Q&A. You can
Okay,
find it under the answered questions, everyone.
Now, we did also have a question come in about grants. So it is important to realize, first of all, that grants typically are for avoiding student loans in the first place. So before you actually go to college, it's a way to get money to help subsidize your education, whether that's undergraduate or graduate. There are far more grants available for undergrad than there are grad school, but they do exist. One thing I would recommend you do is make sure that you do check out options based on your particular state. Some are very state specific. And within that, within the state specific, is where you might be able to find help for student loan relief, as opposed to being proactive about getting money for going back and continuing your education. And some are also really industry specific. So I know like mental health industries have some. There was one that I found that was for like fertility and conception research. If you're getting your doctoral degree in that very niche specific field, you can get up to $50,000 towards your research. So some of these grants are just so specific, you might think there's no way that my unique particular field has money offered. You never know. Just be sure to do a little bit of digging. The Department of Education does offer about 5 different grants available, but if we're looking specifically more at master's or other degrees beyond undergraduate, the only big one that they do offer is for teachers. I don't think it's that great of a deal based on the amount of money, because you also have to serve a minimum of 4 years as a full-time teacher in a high need field for low income students. So that's just like very specific restrictions for about $4,000 a year for your program. So again, having to do the math on whether or not that makes sense for you financially. Now, if that aligns with what you wanted to do in the first place, go get the money. But if it doesn't, you definitely need to think about what the cost benefit analysis is to you specifically. I want to talk about refinancing for a second. I know a couple of these questions came in. Refinancing is this really strange concept, if you're not familiar, where you take out a new loan to pay off an old loan. And the reason I think that it sounds weird is like, why am I going into more debt to pay off this old debt? But the reason you do it is to get yourself on a lower interest rate. So for instance, if your average interest rate across your loans is 8%, and you're able to take out a new loan at 3%, and you use that new loan at 3% to pay off all the 8% loans, now you've consolidated it all in one place, and you have shaved 5% off, which could save you thousands of dollars and time off of the life of your loan. So it can make a lot of sense, except for private loans, I think refinancing is a great idea, particularly if you are in some sort of vulnerable situation in undergraduate, when you were getting your undergraduate degree. Let's say that you had a really bad credit score, or your parents had a really bad credit score and they were helping you get this loan, and you're looking at an interest rate like 12%, which I have seen happen to people. We're talking credit card level interest rates on student loans. In that case, you've graduated, you have a job, you've built your credit, you independently are, in their eyes, a responsible adult. Wonderful. You could probably refinance that down to 5% or so. That's going to save you so much money. But when you're looking at federal student loans, I'm pretty on the whole idea of refinancing. And the reason is because if you refinance a federal student loan, you are making it a private loan, and this cannot be undone. That means you no longer have access to things like income-driven repayment plans. You don't have access to things like student loan forgiveness. And if you think about people who maybe at the end of 2019, early 2020, refinanced all of their federal loans thinking, I'll pay it off quickly, it'll be worth it. And then a pandemic hit, and then they're no longer able to have access to things like the student loan suspension. So they had to make payments on their loans because they were private. That's why I'm always very cautious about the idea of refinancing federal loans. Now, if you are interested in refinancing because you have private loans, or because refinancing federal still sounds good, companies to consider are ones like Common Bond, EarnVest. Do not sleep on credit unions like PenFed, and then SoFi. Some of these names might sound familiar to you, and they have become very popular in the last about 6-7 years. When I first started writing about money in 2013, this was a fairly unknown phenomenon, and they've just kind of exploded as of late. Now, a few things that I want you to consider if you decide to go down the refinancing path is, first, look at that fixed APR. Do not mess with the variable APR. And the reason I say not to mess with it is because fixed, you understand the terms, you understand how much you have to pay every month. Variable on paper looks sexy because it's going to look lower than the fixed rate, but they can yank it up and manipulate that number at any point. This is also really how a large part of 2008 happened, was variable rate mortgages, and we all saw how that went down. So overall, I do suggest that people, by and large, do not use variable. Stick with a fixed rate APR if you're going to refinance. The only time to use variable is if you know I can pay this off really fast, and I am not going to lose my job, and a global pandemic is not going to happen, and I'm going to pay it off in a year. If you have that level of a crystal ball, you can do variable. The other things to consider is that oftentimes refinance companies are focused more on higher income earners. And if you are rejected, that could be a reason for the rejection, as they typically are going after people who earn close to, if not six-figure incomes. You also need to have a 700 plus credit score, 720 or higher, even better, if you want those really competitive low rates when you're looking to refinance. So if right now your credit score is not in a great place, you might want to work on improving it before you bother refinancing. A last point, shop around. Don't just go to one of those refinancing companies, get one quote and say yes. Make sure to shop around at a couple different ones. If you do it within about a 14 to 30 day window, it's not going to damage your credit score a bunch. They're going to see that, oh, you're shopping around and price comparison shopping on refinancing your student loans. So make sure that you do that to get yourself the best deal. And a lot of them will do something called a soft pull, meaning that they can tell you like, oh, you're pre-qualified probably at this rate without actually harming your credit score. So if you ever hear, we do a soft pull, we don't hurt your credit score, that's what that means. I also want you to talk to your employer. If you are traditionally employed, there's this big thing that went out at the end of 2020 by a woman that I follow, who if you don't, you should, Lynette Kofani-Cox. And she tweeted, are you an employee with student loans? Ask your job to pay them ASAP. The CARES Act lets an employer pay off up to $5,250 of your college debt until December 31st of 2020. The payments aren't taxable to you, and your employer gets a tax break. So that means it does not get added to your gross income, and your employer gets a benefit on their payroll. Now here's the thing. The Biden administration expanded this policy, So actually, you have through December of 2025 to take advantage of this. And a lot of people have never heard of this before. Their employers don't necessarily have it set up, or they might not even know that their employer has this set up. So I do recommend going to HR and asking directly, saying something like, I recently found out part of the CARES Act is an option for employers to get a tax break by paying for up to $5,250 towards employee student loans. I was curious if we as a company could consider taking advantage. Are your employers automatically going to do this? No, it takes time. They have to set up a program. It's a whole thing. They might be like, it's not worth it. But employers are doing a better job as of late of trying to retain employees, especially post-pandemic. And this might be a good way to point out how you can nudge in the right direction, particularly for larger sized companies. So I do recommend reaching out to HR, seeing if there's a possibility of putting this kind of program into place. And maybe they don't go up to the full 5,250, but putting any amount of money towards your student loans is really going to help you out. Now, of course, you always want to look to see if there's some sort of catch. Like, do you need to stay for a certain period of time if you take advantage of a credit like this? Also, if your company has any sort of options for furthering educations, whether it's some sort of payment towards, you're going back to school or you're taking certain classes, they probably do actually have the infrastructure in place then to offer something like student loan repayment assistance. So I would definitely reach out to HR and ask if you know that your company already has something like that set up. Anything about this or refinancing?
Yeah, someone asked, is the 5,250 a one-time thing per person, or is it annual?
That's a great question. I think it might be a one-off, but you'll have to ask. I do not actually remember off the top of my head, and I don't want to lead you astray and be like, yeah, it's annual. And then you're like, oh no, that's could have been a lot of money, and it's not. I would not be surprised if it was a one-off. So I would double check that. And also keep in mind that they can spread out how long it could happen. So maybe they'll decide like, we'll do $200 a month, and that's the amount that we're going to do. They might not do one big lump sum. And if they are going to do it, I would be really specific about which loan you want that money going towards, especially if your loans are not consolidated.
Do you know if that applies to grad school loans or
it should apply to grad school loans. So any type of student loan that you have, particularly if it's a federal student loan, I have not heard that it only extends to federal, not private. I have never heard that. But regardless, you should be able to put it towards either type of loan that you have, whether it's undergrad or graduate school.
All right, great.
All right. Now, for those who are dealing with student loans, which if you're here, I assume is all of you, I want to talk through a few different ways to prepare for the inevitability of having to pay them back whether it gets extended after October 1st, the student loan relief suspension, or it could be 6 months from now, it could be in October. Regardless, you want to be prepared. For me, in our household, anytime that we have a big life change going to come up, we do something called simulated budgets. And I highly recommend this for any type of life change, but particularly if you haven't been having to pay on your student loans since March of 2020, then all of a sudden you're going to have to again. What you do is you rework your budget to account for this change. Now, in this particular situation, I want you to create what I refer to as your bare essential budget. So you're looking at expenses that you absolutely cannot compromise on. We're talking housing, transportation, food, insurance, medicine, could be childcare for some, those absolute essential needs. Then add your student loan payment back in. For the case of this, I would just use whatever you were paying pre-COVID, pre-pandemic, and use that number. It might change a little bit, but at least it gives you a baseline. Now you're able to evaluate at that point whether your current income covers all of that money. And if it doesn't, then there has to be some conversations with yourself or your spouse or your partner or family about how you're going to be able to make all of this work. Now, the other thing I would like you to do on living an actual simulated budget is to take that money that you should be putting towards your student loans and put it in the savings account. Actually live your life for the next couple months as if you are already making that student loan payment. This actual simulation is going to make it a much easier transition for you when that time comes. Plus, you put a little money into savings and you're able to create a bit more of a buffer for yourself, whether you want to lop it all towards the student loans once those actually come off of suspension and you want to make one big lump payment, whether there's something else, maybe it's your emergency savings fund, maybe it's hey, we're finally coming out of a pandemic, I want to spend money on something fun, fund, whatever you want to spend it on. But I do highly recommend that you go through the simulation for a couple of months just to get used to how it feels. We've run this a few different times in our household, especially looking at things like, oh, we're going to move and our new rent is going to be $200 more than our current rent. Or like, oh, insurance premiums are changing and it's going to cost us X amount more per month. So it's just a really helpful way to smooth your transition into a different financial situation. Another thing to consider is going back to that idea of the income-driven repayment plans. If you have federal student loans and you were not on an income-driven repayment plan prior to the pandemic, and you have faced a significant financial change throughout the last 15, 16 months, go through the process of actually enrolling in an income-driven repayment plan if you weren't already on one. Just really make sure that you are able to afford your monthly payment relative to your income. The other thing you can do is if you already were or are on an income-driven repayment plan, every year you have to do something called recertify your information. It's usually fairly simple. They take your latest tax statement or your tax return, and they use that to determine that discretionary income and therefore use it to determine your monthly payment. Again, if you've been through a big change, loss of a job, change in like you lost your job, got a new job, it pays less, whatever is happening, go ahead and file the paperwork to recertify your income now. Because as a reminder, there are over 40 million student loan borrowers. So a lot's going to be happening. There's going to be a huge backlog and like calls and recertifying and all of that when we actually come to the point of having to go back to making these monthly payments. So please be proactive and do it now to save yourself a little bit of a headache in the future. And I want to also emphasize enrolling in an income-driven repayment plan now or recertifying your IDR will not impact the current suspension on your payments. You still can stay on suspension. You're just getting a little bit of a head start on all of that legwork that you have to do. The other thing I want you to consider for those of you who are maybe feeling a little bit more aggressive, you're like, financially, I'm in an okay place. I want to start paying these off more aggressively. I'm not really looking or I'm not eligible to be on a forgiveness plan. There are a few hacks that I want you to consider using to reduce cost. So first, biweekly payments. You know how when you're paid biweekly, there's those 2 months of a year that you get those sweet, sweet 3 paychecks in a month situation? You're using the same sort of strategy to put towards your student loans. So one, you take your monthly payment and you divide it in half. So let's say it's $300, divide in half, that's $150 every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks, you make a payment on your student loans of $150. Ultimately, what this is going to do is squeeze out 2 additional half payments, 3. So it's 2. I don't know why I wrote 3. So you will end up making 1 additional monthly payment. So instead of making 12 months worth of payments, you will make 13 months worth of payments. And the reason that that's so important is because every little bit counts. If what you can do is just pay $10 more per month than your minimum monthly payment, you will be shocked at how fast you actually can be chipping away at the total principal of your student loans. And I say that because I have a friend of mine who did just $10 more a month and shaved a full year off of her student loan repayment. Because once you're putting just a little bit more, you can request that that gets put directly towards the principal balance, not towards interest, not towards future interest, but the principal balance. So you're starting to really knock away at the money that you owe to your lender. One catch though on the biweekly payments, there are some lenders, especially with private lenders, who unfortunately won't accept monthly payments. They won't allow you to do it. So what I recommend that you do then instead is if they won't allow you to do it, you just take that extra half, $150, whatever it is, and just add it to the regular monthly payment that you're making. So you're paying just a little bit more on those 2 months that you actually are earning that extra paycheck or what have you. So those are just some pretty easy lift hacks in order to reduce cost. refinancing and lowering your interest rate, another great hack to reduce cost on those private student loans. And I want to address what happens if you stop paying. So if you go delinquent, that'll be after 15 days of not paying, and your loans will be put in what's known as delinquent status. This is sort of like the yellow flashing warning sign. Once you go into default, which is after 270 days or so, things get bad. Particularly if you're talking about the federal government, they can come after your wages, they can come after your tax refund, they can come after Social Security or your disability benefits. Some states even allow for your professional license to get revoked in this case that you go default on your student loans. There, I believe, are 20 different states. Unfortunately, I do not know them all off the top of my head, that do things like if you're a nurse, if you're a real estate agent, they can take your professional license because you defaulted. So sometimes people will be like, oh, that's the first one to stop paying because they can't take back your college degree, but they could repossess your car or take back your house. Sure, unless they can take your license and then you can't work anymore. So keep that in mind. And then private lenders can sue you in order to garnish your wages. So you would actually have to go to court and have a conversation about how much you're going to have to owe your lender. Now, bankruptcy was another question that did come up a couple of times, this idea of, can I not actually discharge in bankruptcy? How is that legal? You're going to hear that from folks a lot, that student loans cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. Typically, they're referring to federal. Sometimes it's an easier lift with private. It's not entirely true. It's like mostly true. Federal student loans can be discharged in bankruptcy, but it's not an automatic part of the bankruptcy process. You actually have to file an entirely separate action known as adversary proceeding, and you have to prove that repayment is going to cause an undue hardship. And it can't be based on like how you feel the hardship is. It's based on the math that the court is doing, which I'm sure is tied to your state's poverty level. And they're going to see if you can maintain a, quote, minimal standard of living. I can't give you numbers on what that means because it's going to vary by state and court. And if you can, then they'll be like, sorry, no, you still have to pay. If you can't, and if you've also made a good faith effort to repay, so the problem is if you went super delinquent and you were not paying at all, you did not make a good faith effort, you might also have a judge that's like, screw you, you have to pay them. It also might not be a full dismissal. It could be a partial dismissal of your student loans in bankruptcy. So it's just important to know, while it's possible, it's a very big lift and it's not always 100%. So you shouldn't have it in your head that if everything goes sideways, at least there's the option of bankruptcy and a clean slate, because that's not always true with student loans. And for those who are thinking of returning to grad school, I really recommend first that you run a cost-benefit analysis with realistic salary expectations, which is a really personal finance response to that question. And I'm saying that because a lot of times we think about grad school because we want to do something in our career and we can't figure out how to get there otherwise. Or there might be like, you have to go to grad school and then it makes sense. But you should think about how much you're going to have to take on in student loans compared to realistically how much you're actually going to earn. And is there a cheaper way to cash flow this? Can you take a little bit longer? Can you go to a school that costs a little bit less? Maybe your employer offers some sort of financial benefit that you weren't aware that they offered. And I wouldn't trust aggregator websites to help you determine a realistic salary, like those like salary.com, glassdoor.com. They can be helpful, but instead I would cold call, cold email folks. Like go to LinkedIn, look at people doing a job that you want to do. I also recommend this if you're negotiating your salary at work, and send a cold pitch. They get them. And also, like, who cares if they say no or never respond to you? So saying stuff like, I'm considering returning to grad school for X, fill in your industry here, and I'm trying to get a realistic expectation of salary in the industry. Your job is one I'd like to have post-graduation. Do you mind telling me your ballpark salary? Or another strategy is, do you mind telling me if you make over or under insert an amount of money? Getting that information can be really powerful for you in figuring out whether or not it does make sense ultimately for you to go to grad school or to pay to go to a particular program. I also want you to think through two other things. How will you feel if you don't end up utilizing that master's degree the way that you thought? Or what is the benefit of this program beyond the education? Does it cost a lot? but hey, the network is unbelievable, and their, legacy of putting people into positions that I want to be in is so high. I like going to just be set up in a way I never could be otherwise. Or is it like, I don't know, probably just the education. You have to decide if that price tag actually makes the most sense, or if this is purely an emotional decision that you're making. Finally, and then we'll get back to questions. I just want to make sure we get through this because it might answer some of your questions. Finding the almighty balance, balancing between student loans and everything else going on in your life. First, you want to identify your priorities. So like, is debt freedom absolutely the ultimate goal for you? Or do you also want to have a balanced life and start building wealth? And I'm just going to go ahead and say, you do not have to be debt free to start building wealth. A really big point on that is the idea of your 401k or your 403b, or contributing to an IRA, particularly if you're like me and self-employed. Please put money away for future you in retirement. It is so important to start that process early. And if you keep procrastinating until like, oh, I have all my student loans paid off, or oh, I'm going to try to hit this goal first, you are losing out on the number one asset of an investor, and that is time. As a one thing you can never recoup. It is so hard to play catch up. Even if you double down and put twice as much money in the future, you usually do not catch up to if you had just started earlier and smaller. So I beseech you to please, even if you have student loans, put at least some money aside in investing for retirement. And then finally, I would also look at options like the forgiveness plans, like the income-driven repayment plans. Even if you don't love having debt, if you can put yourself on one of those plans to give yourself a little bit of breathing room in all areas of your life, it might ultimately end up being a more healthy and balanced option for you. All right, so with that, I want to use the last 10 minutes for any other questions we have on all of this.
Wonderful. We just got one question. If you enter a master's program and take out loans and get into a doctoral program that provides full funding and a livable wage, are you accruing interest on those master's loans while you're in the doctoral program?
That is a good question. Typically, you are able to keep your loans on deferment while you're still enrolled in school, but you would have to look at the fine print of, does that count if you've progressed on to a new degree? But typically, yes. But again, I would also look at the fine print on the difference between federal and private. That usually is more of a federal perk than a private perk. So I would have explicit calls and conversations with lenders to make sure you understand whether or not it gets deferred.
Okay. Someone asked if there's benefits to moving the due date of your payments, or is there a downfall to that?
I would say, just as long as you never accidentally miss a payment, that would be the downfall. But moving, if you're able to pick your due date and you're able to line it up more with whenever you personally get paid, and it's just easier for you mentally to budget and cash flow that way, great. But if it's not, or if it makes it easier to miss, and like, man, calendar alerts are everything. Like I have those for absolutely every little thing in my life. So just make sure if you do change it, one, that when the change happens, you don't accidentally miss one on the between the original date and the new date. I would even like call and confirm with the lender that you're all good, and make sure that you have calendar alerts for all of your payments, or set them up to be taken automatically. Just make sure you always have money in that account so you don't go overdraft.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, well, I think we've covered most of the questions. Someone asked another investing question. Would you recommend maxing out 401k before investing in other things?
Yes, with one exception. So it is great to max out a 401k first. You are lowering your taxable income, which means that it's going to be a benefit to you come tax season. So there's less money, assuming it's traditional. If it's Roth, if you've heard the word Roth IRA or Roth 401k, you're paying taxes now, but you get to take the money out tax-free in the future. Either way, that's an easy lift to be investing for your future. But my exception to the rule is, if you have a more medium-term financial goal that you want to be investing for, maybe we're looking at something that's between like 10 to 20 years away, and you're like me, you're in your 30s and retirement's like 30 years away, and you want that money to be invested, you could open a taxable brokerage account and split and do like a little bit of money towards that, as opposed to everything just in retirement for locked up until you are eligible. 59 and a half is when you can start taking distributions without a tax penalty. I know that's like a lot of jargon. I think the fastest answer is, yeah, sure, max out first and then focus on others. But with everything in finance, there are shades of gray. So it can make sense to not max out if you also want to be putting money in a different investment. Just know that this investment is taxable in a different way than your retirement accounts. And if you have access to a retirement account and you have an employer match, please at least take advantage of the match. And my last soapbox on retirement accounts, make sure the money is actually invested. That is a huge issue I run into all the time with my community. People will just put money into a 401k, but never actually pick investments. And their money is doing no better than sitting in a savings account for sometimes a couple years. I have heard horror stories of decades. So you want to make sure your money is actually invested and working for you and not just sitting in a cash management account. How do you know? Log into your 401k plan. First, if you see the words like cash management or settlement account, that's a big red flag. Or if your money hasn't really moved up significantly over the last year, another huge red flag, because the market's been going bonkers. So if you haven't seen much growth, it's probably sitting in cash. You can just call up your plan provider, maybe that's like a Fidelity or a Charles Schwab, a company like that, and have a conversation with someone to help make sure that you actually are invested for retirement, not just saving for retirement.
Wonderful. Well, Erin, thank you so much. You've provided so much clarity. I hope this has reduced stress for everyone who's watching. And thank you so much for being here again. Our next topics include a variety of things: estate management for authors, marketing, finances.
I'm excited for the marketing one. We'll be talking all about what happens when you want to market your book and how you plan for that financially.
Yes, that'll be great. All right, well, thank you. And thanks everyone for being here, and get in touch with us at authorsguild.org anytime.
All right, thanks.
Thanks. Bye-bye.